Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Invasive Plants. What are they and what can be done? This presentation is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series, a series developed by a group of regional organizations known for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs to a nationwide audience. In case you're not familiar with the organizations, they are all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, and Eco-Landscape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Bruce Wenning. Bruce is a horticultural at the Country Club in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, where he's responsible for garden design and management, invasive species management, and natural history of the grounds. Bruce's background includes formal garden design and installation, as well as public space management. Bruce has 20 years of experience working with exotic invasive plant species common to Massachusetts for both private and public clients. In addition to his invasive species expertise, Bruce specializes in plant pest diagnostics, insect taxonomy, and ecological landscape consultation. Bruce is also on the board of directors for the Ecological Landscape Alliance and is a regular contributor to the ELA newsletter and Newton Tab. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Penny. And I think we'll get started now. And I'm going to go through a bunch of slides, and I have a little script here to keep me on track. So this is the ecology and control of common woody exotic invasive plants, and it involves the plants that I'm most familiar with. In general, most exotic invasive grasses and forbs infesting the United States are from Europe, and most, not all, of the exotic invasive woody plants are from Asia. There are ecological overlaps in their respective distribution ranges in their home regions of Europe and Asia. Most of the infestation by these plants began to accelerate or spread uncontrollably into unmanaged city and town forests and other land managed by nonprofit conservation organizations after World War II, as urban and suburban sprawl increased and open space or natural areas decreased. The suburban woodlands remaining today are considered to have a high natural heritage value to the local communities where they are located. Unfortunately, the remaining native plant populations are slowly being pushed out or overtaken by the more aggressive exotic invasive plants. So a question I'd like to put forward is, what has been slowly happening to our native woodland ecology over the past 70 or more years, particularly on our suburban woodlands? Well, invasive plants have become pests where the native plants grow. We live in invasive plant species environments. This is due to many reasons, which are all related to human behaviors that have changed our wild areas of yesteryear to the fragmented landscapes of today. Suburbia has expanded so much over the past 70 years or so that existing intact woodlands have been reduced in size and diversity due to the combination of ever-increasing populations of invasive plants, construction activities of roads and accompanying infrastructure, housing and commercial developments, timber and farming operations, and poorly managed open spaces on existing private and public lands, just to mention a few. So, fire suppression in local and regional areas throughout the United States has contributed to the expansion of exotic invasive woody plants in our dwindling suburban woodlands, as well as in state and federal parks and conservation areas, both public and private. So here we have, what are invasive plants? Well, invasive exotic plants are naturalized, aggressive, not weedy, because I don't like using the word weedy anymore, non-native plants. And I'll explain the not weediness at the end of the lecture. Some were intentionally introduced for use in agriculture, horticulture, medicine, forestry, or wildlife enhancement programs, and many were introduced for display, botanical displays in garden estates and arboretums. Most people involved with controlling the establishment and spread of exotic invasive plants agree that learning about their invasive traits of each plant will help with understanding their ecology, especially in the efforts to control them more effectively and efficiently. So here we have exotic invasive plants common to Massachusetts. There's a few more that could be added to the list, but these are the ones that I've been most familiar with. And almost all 13 or more of these species are from Asia and were introduced into the United States for various horticultural reasons. Again, for erosion control or wildlife enhancement programs. Some of these plants were introduced into the United States over 100 years ago, and they are the following, except where noted. So we have Glossy Buckthorn is number 1. It's a shade-tolerant shrub. And at the bottom, we have black Swallow-Wort. And I've listed these plants in order of abundance from what I'm used to seeing on a lot of parks and sanctuaries in the eastern part of Massachusetts. Glossy buckthorn seems to be the most numerous, but it's not always the case. And black Swallow-Wort seems to be the least, but that's not always the case. So this abundance ranking is really where I work, is from where I worked at Massachusetts Audubon Society in Belmont, Mass. from 1991 to 2006. The abundance from most abundant to least may be different now. And your abundance list for your managed sites could be similar or very different. It all depends on the soils, the site, the size of the area, the surrounding invasive properties, and the age of the infestation, things like that. So that's our culprits right here. And here's one of them, black Swallow-Wort. It's a vine. It's can be quite numerous in patches and forest understories and also in fields. And it's very hard to pull this out of the ground. If you pull the vine out, the vines get about 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 feet long. They can go up on fences and stone walls. They have a tendency, where I have seen them, to grow in with grasses in upper and lower meadows or in fields. And when you try to pull these out of the ground, they have a very deep and tightly adhering root system, so they'll break off. And so what a lot of people do when they manage this one is they mow it down or just pull it out of the ground, and they make sure that if they have the seed pods, that the pods are just put into a black trash bag, and they can be put up with the regular trash for incineration. So you don't want these things to get too much out of control. Frequent cutting of black Swallow-Wort. When you cut it and wait a few weeks, let it grow out at least 3 more feet, and then cut it again. You can manage it that way. I have managed it that way as well as with herbicides. And believe it or not, with stump application, even though the vines are very tiny, and all 3 have worked. Here we have Glossy Buckthorn, and I put this slide in because it's growing at my site where I work. This is from 2010. As you can see that the stumps are either single or double. They were cut in June, and this was taken, well, I'd say 2 months later. And you can see how numerous it can resprout. That's going to be a problem if you don't curtail that by either using an herbicide if you like, or in this case, I just pull them out of the ground and with a weed wrench. What makes a plant invasive? Well, we have these ecological traits, and a lot of these plants that we're speaking about tonight share all these traits. Some have the traits more ingrained, I'd say, or more inside their DNA than others. But trait 1 is high seed production and good seed viability. So Asiatic bittersweet vine produces a huge amount of seed annually, but only about 2/3 of them will sprout. But the sheer number of seeds produced ensures that bittersweet spreads rapidly. Glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn also produce a large amount of annual seeds, as does garlic mustard, Japanese barberry, common barberry, bush honeysuckles, Norway maple, tree of heaven, winged euonymus, multiflora rose, and porcelain berry vine. Once seeds are produced, they will mostly germinate. However, not all seeds germinate as soon as they contact the bare soil. Delayed germination may occur. Seeds displaying this trait become part of the seed bank, which is the collection of dormant seeds in the soil of the infested site, which can linger until environmental conditions are right for germination at a later point in time. Researchers have found that some exotic invasive species, such as purple loosestrife and garlic mustard, demonstrate high seed viability. They can persist in the soil for many years before germinating. And just as a side note, there are many weed seeds typical of agricultural soils that exhibit seed viability from 5 to 40 years in the soil, depending on the soil type. So a lot of the research is going into the seed bank longevity of a lot of these common exotic invasive plants. I have heard people think that glossy buckthorn lasts in the soil for 7 years, but I couldn't confirm that. So just be careful where you get your information from. Try to get it from universities and government websites for an accurate count of years that a seed can be in the soil as part of the soil bank. All right, vectors. A seed is easily dispersed by wind, animals, or water. For most exotic invasive plants to be naturally successful at invading areas, they must rely on a vector, or a carrier or a transporting agent. For example, birds feed on the berries and seeds and then sporadically deposit them over the landscape. The seeds of Asiatic bittersweet vine, glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, bush honeysuckles, privet, English holly, multiflora rose, winged euonymus, autumn olive, and porcelain berry vine are primarily dispersed by birds over great distances. The small seed of common reed, which is Phragmites, is carried by wind and water, and the lightweight seeds of garlic, mustard, and black swallow-wort can be carried by wind. The winged samaras of Norway maple and tree of heaven are carried by wind currents, and the seeds of the aquatic invasive purple loosestrife, that's spread by water currents. The vector trait characterizes the most successful exotic invasive plant species. Okay, trait 3, sexual reproduction or their breeding system. Most all invasive plants reproduce sexually. The plant requires pollen from a male flower to fertilize the ovary of a female flower. Sexual reproduction can either require separate male and female plants, and this is termed dioecious, or sexual reproduction can involve separate male and female flowers on the same plant, and this is termed monoecious reproduction. Monoecious plants can self-fertilize, producing flowers, fruit, and seed on the same plant. Since only a single monoecious plant is needed to start a population, invasive plants of this type can rapidly colonize and spread into new areas. Most invasive plants are monoecious, which is why they are so threatening to our native landscapes and ecosystems. In fact, most have the monoecious condition called perfect flowers. Plants with perfect flowers have male and female reproductive parts consolidated into the same flower and always on the same plant. Glossy buckthorn and most other of our exotic invasive plants have this flower arrangement. Again, dioecious plants, on the other hand, have the male and female flowers located on separate plants. So Asiatic bittersweet vine, common buckthorn, which is Rhamhus cathartica, tree of heaven, and Norway maple have separate sex plants most of the time. Once seeds are produced from either breeding system, whether it's monoecious or dioecious, they will mostly germinate. Now, some familiar monoecious plants where separate male and female flowers are on the same plant are with some of our native plants, particularly pines, oaks, firs, spruces, larch, beech, hickories, walnuts. They're all wind pollinated. The perfect flower exotic invasive plants, which is a monoecious condition, again, where male and female flower parts are consolidated into one flower on the same plant, they are insect pollinated. And these invasives are glossy buckthorn, the bush honeysuckles, Japanese knotweed is mostly perfect, Japanese barberry, common barberry, Multiflora Rose, winged euonymus, which usually has perfect flowers, porcelainberry vine, black locust, which is not native to New England, but it's native south to us, and garlic mustard, and goutweed occasionally. So what we like to say about these breeding systems is that they can shape or influence the natural distribution patterns of plants. For example, Glossy Buckthorn has perfect flowers, is vectored by birds, and it has a random distribution usually through a woodland. Where on the other hand, Asiatic bittersweet vine has separate sexed vines. It has a tendency to be in clumped distribution. So their breeding systems can contribute to their distribution along with how they're vectored. All right, trait 4, vegetative or asexual reproduction, and this involves sprouting. So vegetative or asexual reproduction produces new shoots without the benefit of male pollen and female ovary contact, as is required for sexual reproduction. The new shoots are genetically identical to the parent from which they arise, except where mutations occur. Many exotic invasive woody plants sprout or send up shoots after the main stem or branch has been cut or broken. Some species, such as Asiatic bittersweet vine and black swallow-wort, can send up new vine shoots from large existing roots, and these are called root sprouts. The cut stumps of glossy buckthorn, Asiatic bittersweet vine, Multiflora Rose, common buckthorn, Norway maple, and others will all send up new shoots from cut stumps if an appropriate herbicide is not readily applied. Others can sprout from roots like rhizomes, which is Japanese knotweed. Tree of heaven can sprout from roots as well as from cut stumps. Now, I have observed glossy buckthorn producing new shoots and roots from branch tips held to the ground by fallen branches of large overstory trees. However, you should keep in mind that any woody exotic invasive plant exhibiting the monoecious breeding system will give rise to flowers on new shoots that will self-fertilize and produce more berries or seeds than the original uncut stem. A planned management method of either herbicide application or repeated mowing or cutting over many years is necessary for optimal control. Now, there's a caution here. Do not cut berry-producing vines or shrubs just once a year. You'll create a worse problem, like the earlier slide I showed of buckthorn. It was cut, had a cut stump, it was not treated, and it sent out, 12, 13, 18 shoots per cut stump. So that should have been cut many times during the season, growing season, possibly 4 times if I want, and then do it year after year after year until you shrink the roots. But with buckthorn, since it has such a shallow root system, you can easily pull the plant out. All right, trait 5, predator avoidance and or deterrence. Some exotic invasive plants have physical structures like spines and prickles that deter grazing animals and humans from touching them. Japanese barberry and Multiflora Rose are good examples. Other plants produce chemical compounds unpalatable to plant-feeding animals, such as Japanese stiltgrass, garlic mustard, the buckthorns, winged euonymus, and so on. They're not fed on by many animals, so they may have a little bit of not defoliation, but feeding by insects, but it's very rare. So that's a good trait to have when you're competing with our native plants. Trait 6, the timing of leaf out and leaf loss. Several exotic invasive plants acquire an edge over our native plants by leafing out earlier in the spring and holding on to their leaves a little longer in the fall. This trait allows certain invasive plants to carry out photosynthesis longer than most native plant species, thus allowing more time for the invasive plant to store greater quantity of carbohydrates in their roots for more efficient growth and development when environmental conditions are right. Glossy buckthorn, the honeysuckles, garlic mustard, Multiflora Rose, and Japanese barberry are a few of these species that exhibit this trait. Now, trait 7 is sun-shade tolerance. There are some exotic invasive plants that exhibit the ability to germinate and become established in shade. This is known as being shade tolerant, and it is an extremely good trait to have when competing with our native plants. Shade-tolerant species, such as Glossy Buckthorn and Asiatic Bittersweet vine, will not produce a large increase in growth or seed on a yearly basis when growing under shady conditions, but will not necessarily succumb to shade as a limiting factor either. However, don't be fooled. Shade-tolerant invasive species can grow rapidly when the shade opens up due to overstory branch dieback, breakage, or wind-thrown or fallen trees. I'm going to give you a list of all these plants later on. So take notice of shade-tolerant invasive species when studying and observing exotic invasive plants. Urban and suburban woodlands generally differ in light levels from mature forests, especially evergreen forests, by having more light reaching the woodland floor in the spring and early summer, and thus increasing the probability of exotic invasive plant germination and establishment. So here's a little note here for everyone. Norway Maple is shade tolerant, and that's why you find it in the interior of woodlands. And Tree of Heaven is shade intolerant. Shade is a big enemy to Tree of Heaven. So you won't find it really in the interior of woodlands unless the woodland was very young 20, 30 years ago, and there was a lot more light reaching that Tree of Heaven, and fast and could reach canopy height and maintain itself in the woods. But other than that, you'll find Tree of Heaven, since it's shade intolerant, in openings, in along trails, along parking lots, and places where there's a lot more high sunlight, irradiation, I should say. All right, garlic mustard can spread and flower in the understory shade. It is also shade tolerant. I think shade tolerant is one of the most effective traits of these invasive plants. Now, trait 8 is time of year of fruiting duration. How long a plant can stay in fruit. Different exotic invasive plants set fruit at different times during the growing season. They all do not set fruit and seed in the fall. The fruiting stage lasts longer for most invasive plants than native plants. For example, the native black cherry tree has a ripened fruit duration period of about 3 weeks, but the ripened fruit stage for glossy buckthorn lasts close to 3 months, which makes this species more available as a food source for birds than the cherry does. According to my colleague and friend and ecological restorationist, Josh Ellsworth, who now teaches at Brandeis, he says to get the maximum control of for the least amount of effort, one should always observe when your targeted exotic invasive plant sets fruit and seed, and remove that plant before the seeds mature. He strongly suggests focusing control efforts in July for glossy buckthorn and black swallow-wort, August for autumn olive and purple loosestrife, and September for Asiatic bittersweet vine. This type of control timing gives the maximum control for the least amount of effort. And I have an ELA, an article on our website at ELA called The Flowering and Fruiting Times of Some of the More Common Exotic Invasive Woody Plants in Eastern Massachusetts. And just to sort of give you a few examples here on this trait, is that Tree of Heaven flowers from April through May, but it fruits from August through October. Winged euonymus, burning bush, flowers from May through June, but it fruits from July through October. So the fruiting time is much longer than for most native trees and shrubs. So for winged euonymus, if you wanted to knock it out of your wildlife refuge or your park or your backyard and you only want to do it once, for winged euonymus, it flowers from May through June, then just take the plants out in June before it can start to fruit, which is from July through October. But I have a list I've written on a different fact sheet about all this, and you can get it through the ELA website. That's if you want more information. Now, trait 9 is the ability, and I've added this one, is the ability to germinate in a broad range of soil and site conditions. And this trait is a pioneer species characteristic. Okay, now here we go now with some of these plants. Glossy buckthorn has a shallow root system, so this is one that I pulled out of the ground from a previous slide you saw earlier. You can see the 1 foot stump, and I let it grow. I think I cut this in the fall of 2009, and this is like the picture in June of 2010, and it's put out at least 12 or 15 additional asexually produced sprouts from the stump, and the root system is very shallow, but it's got a lot of power. So that's a good demonstration there of the root systems on Glossy Buckthorn is shallow, so you can pull them out pretty good. But I work with volunteers a lot over the past 25 years, and they're learning about Glossy Buckthorn. We'll go into the woods by hand and try to pull them out. And when some people can't pull out a small Glossy Buckthorn, it really is a cherry tree. It looks sort of like buckthorn to the novice. And cherries, the native cherry has a deep taproot, whereas buckthorn does not. So now you have ecological damage caused by these exotic invasive plants. As we'll see later on in the lecture, native plant succession is affected. So want to keep that in mind. And a lot of invasive plants exhibit growth. Let me get rid of this thing here. Whoops. Can't really read that slide from where I am. Growth and a lot of prolific seeding, which creates more shade that impacts native species that are not shade tolerant. So here's some stump sprouts of Glossy Buckthorn again. These original stumps were about 1 inch in diameter and at the base of a white oak tree, and they were cut, I think, probably in June. And this is a picture of it in, I think, sometime in July. So they can resprout pretty quickly. Ecological damage caused by exotic invasive plants. Well, ecosystem processes may be altered, and you read a lot about this in books covering this subject. It may affect plant soil fertility cycles, decomposition rates of litter layers, soil erosion rates, and water tables. All of these processes affect food web interactions, and some exotic plants may hybridize with closely related species. Here's a Glossy Buckthorn understory with an oak and white pine and red maple overstory. Now, this was at my job, and we cut it in 2009, I think. They mostly were single stem, 7, 8, and 9 foot Glossy Buckthorns. And the following year, we came back, and this is what they look like. Each single stem produced anywhere from 15 to 35 extra stems, all produced asexually. And since this is a plant that's monoecious with perfect flowers, each new stem now has the possibility of producing hundreds of more berries, close to a 3-month period of time. So you can see that with improper management, if you don't really get rid of these things, you only want to cut them down once, and you don't go back to, follow up and continue to cut them, or at least pull them out of the ground, you're going to be in really big trouble. Asiatic bittersweet vine is a twining vine. That's a fast grower. It's not really rooted too deeply if it's a young plant. The berries are quite attractive, actually. And a lot of Christmas wreaths have been made out of these vines in the old days, I guess. Maybe even now, I'm not sure. They get fruit in the fall, and they're very characteristic red berries with a yellow fruit covering. Here we have Asiatic bittersweet berries, but the vines are growing up on buckthorn. So here you have 2 invasives that are both shade tolerant. One's a vine and another one's a shrub, and they're battling it out. Or at least they did. I got rid of all these things. And they have the characteristic orange or orange-yellow roots. So when you pull this vine out of the ground and you see orange roots, if you don't know how to identify the plant, you can be sure that it's Asiatic bittersweet vine. This is a small vine. These are quite commonly seen in the gardens where I work. This is from a garden in Dover, Massachusetts. Had bark nuggets in the garden, and it was in the deep shade of a bunch of very tall, bushy yews, or taxus plants right near the person's pool. So this was an indication that birds roost in the yews while they're viewing people in the pool. When people in the pool left, they probably went down to the pool to drink. The person who had the pool did not use very many chemicals in the pool. So one thing I've noticed about bittersweet vine is it seems to concentrate around areas of ponds, excuse me, ponds or streams, close to where birds can get water, insects, and they can roost in that area. And when they roost, and there's a lot of defecation of the berries will take off and create these massive entanglements as time goes on. Here's a massive entanglement of bittersweet vine using itself as a scaffold. So these are several vines from the same plant, and it's going up onto these arborvitae trees. By the way, I took all these plants out completely that we're showing today. This is Asiatic bittersweet vine. It's, I don't know, almost 2.5 inches in diameter. It's about 25 to 30 years old. So this is from the Country Club in Brookline. It's no longer there. And it was in this mass that you're seeing right now of these arborvitaes that were in the middle of the golf course. It was an island of trees, and in the interior of this island of mostly arborvitaes that were very old were a tremendous amount of Asiatic bittersweet vine. All of them started when in the shade of the understory of these giant trees, and they grow rapidly towards the sun. And now, as you can see, all that orange mass up there, that's the vine and fruit. Damage caused by Asiatic bittersweet vine is it has a twining effect, so it strangles the host plant, meaning the scaffolding plant, and it prevents the photosynthate that's produced in the leaves of the host plant through photosynthesis. It prevents that downward movement, so it builds up just above the strangulation point where the vine is on the host plant there. Okay, we're moving off to goutweed. I'm familiar with this plant. It's an excellent ground cover, but it's a terrible invasive. It's from Europe. A lot of these goutweeds that are green like this, the original, not the variegated, but the original, they were used in early estates in New England as ground covers. They escaped to the woods. A lot of the times they were dug out of gardens because they just overtook them, and a lot of the green refuse was thrown into the woods. So if you find goutweed growing in the woods, it could have been deposited there by some old garden workers of yesteryear or current landscapers of today. When it does grow in the woods, it is shade tolerant, and it seems to grow in radiating patches. It will produce these white flowers, and then they'll produce seed like the goutweed here in fruit and seed. I haven't run across too much of this in a lot of the woods that I've been involved with over the past 25 years, but it was a problem in at the Mass Audubon site where I used to work in Belmont, because it was an old Yankee estate prior to it becoming an Audubon site, and it was a site that the Frederick Law Olmsted firm had put together, and the family that had the estate put goutweed in the gardens probably back in the 40s. And so when I was working up there, it was we had a lot of volunteers continuously weeding out goutweed. The thing about goutweed is the roots are like spaghetti, white spaghetti looking roots, and just a fragment of the root can start a new goutweed plant, a fragment being 1/4 of an inch. Okay, Multiflora Rose is another shade tolerant Asian plant. Of course, it's a beautiful looking plant, but like all these plants I'm showing, they were really in estate gardens and arboretums at first, and in home yards over the past 50 years. But Multiflora Rose, you find it in patches in the woods. They produce these reddish berries, and the berries are very attractive to birds, and the birds then eat them and distribute them throughout the woods wherever they tend to roost. Here's a crabapple covered by Multiflora Rose where I work. This was taken in 2009, and the green mass is the Multiflora Rose, and the white flowering portion of that mass is actually the actual crabapple. This has subsequently been removed completely, and there's to get rid of Multiflora Rose, it's no different than other woody plants. You can pull them out or you can stump applicate them. We'll go over that in a little while. Garlic mustard. I've dealt with this like many people have, and I'm also a volunteer at the Newton Conservators in Newton, Mass, where this is a huge problem in Cold Spring Park as well as other areas around Newton. And the lady that I volunteer for is Catherine Howard, and she has worked extensively with her volunteers on removing garlic mustard. Now, garlic mustard is, again, a beautiful herbaceous ground cover, but it's an invasive. It's shade tolerant, and it can take over an area pretty quickly. It's a biennial, meaning that this is the first year looking plant. They just put a rosette of these leaves out, and the second year, they'll put up a stalk, and that's when it will bloom and produce seeds. So this is garlic mustard in bloom. This is a combination of first and second year plants of garlic mustard. And you can see that they can grow up in their second year to be anywhere from 2 to 3 to almost 4 feet tall. They're easily pulled out of the ground. However, you can spend a lot of time on your hands and knees hand picking these shallow rooted plants out of the ground. In areas where it's extensively covering the woodland floor, I use a golf club, I call it sickle, that you swing, and you can cut it down as if you're golfing. And if you cut garlic mustard down when it's in this second year stage, it will curtail the plant from putting out another stem, although some stems will come back, but you can actually kill the plant by just cutting it in its second year stage. Bush honeysuckles, shade intermediate plants, and they don't really go into the interior of a woods if the woods is an old woods with a lot of shade. They produce these beautiful, again, flowers, and people have seen them. There's many different honeysuckles. This is a Morrow's honeysuckle, and they produce these red berries, which are very attractive to birds. And like with buckthorn and Asiatic bittersweet vine, they're vectored by birds and defecated all over the woods. And if there's a site that's appropriate for these things to germinate, they'll do it. And usually it's when in partial shade. Bush honeysuckles can tolerate shade, but they really are a shade intermediate plant. This is winged euonymus, which is really taking over the woods where I volunteer in Newton, Massachusetts. A lot of these plants are planted in people's yards because they're extremely good looking plant. I think Michael Durr in his book says that winged euonymus is one of the best woody shrubs for horticultural purposes in terms of durability and beauty and interest and so on and so forth. They have these characteristic brown wings coming off their stems and branches, so they have great ornamental value in the winter. They also produce a lot of berries that are attractive to birds. And this is why they're called burning bush. The fall color is spectacular, but unfortunately, it's a shade tolerant invasive plant, and I've seen this in deep shade, and they can get quite big if they're not removed over the years. And they can live to be 75 years old or longer. So I mean, they're quite stable in that sense of the word. they can live a long time in the woods, and they will take over eventually, like buckthorn can. That means take over the understory. Japanese barberry is another shrub. It has these spines on it that you don't want to get too close to it and touch it. A lot of deer don't feed on this shrub because of the spines, and probably because of the unpalatability of the leaves. And they're a shade intermediate plant. They can be in patches throughout the woods. I know that they were troublesome in Arcadia Park in Maine, and a lot of the ranges up there had a invasive plant removal program where they were just removing Japanese barberry. And they had escaped from old-fashioned estates that were close by in the area. And they're a very durable plant for cities. They can tolerate pollution. They resprout when you run them over with a plow. They're pretty durable plants. They look good, but unfortunately, they are an invasive. And if you can remove them by cutting them and being careful when you cut that you don't poke yourself with the spines or the thorns, they should be removed. They also will respond to stump application. It's another good example of how good looking their berries are, but they are attractive to birds and they should be removed. Tree of Heaven is a shade intolerant invasive tree. Right now, I just heard that this new insect called the spotted lanternfly, which is a homopteran pest, likes to feed on Tree of Heaven, I think for reproductive purposes. So we have an invasive insect coming up the coast from the Pennsylvania, Maryland area up the coast, probably to here sometime. I hope not. In its host plant for survival, for reproduction, I think it's Tree of Heaven. They have these compound leaves. And this is a picture I took on the hood of my car. And this is another photo I took where you can see at the base of the leaf, you'll see these bumps. Whoops, let me go back. And those are leaf glands, and it's an identification characteristic. You can separate it from other compound-leaved plants if you don't know, but these little, where my cursor is right here, these little bumps. And there's one right here, there's some right here at the base of the leaves. They're called leaf glands, and they're very characteristic for identification purposes. The Tree of Heaven leaf scar is also like a shield, but it does not include or enclose, I should say, the lateral bud. So if you pull off a compound leaf and you have the leaf glands and you have this kind of leaf scar, where the lateral bud is not embedded in the leaf scar, it's Tree of Heaven. Tree of Heaven is like sun, but it also does a big number on stone walls, foundations, sidewalks. It's really an urban menace. In the woods, and I've seen it grow quite large in wooded areas. It's usually in areas that were once sunny, if the tree is now big, or it's small and growing in sunny areas. So shade is a big, big enemy to Tree of Heaven. And it's a plant that is tough to remove. You can't really pull it out of the ground with a weed wrench. You can try it, but I recommend stump applicating with an appropriate glyphosate herbicide that's for woody plants. And let it rot in place. Now, Tree of Heaven that I have stump applicated did come back, if they're large trees, through through sprouts from the roots. So this is an invasive that sprouts from the stump as well as from the roots. But you can kill it. It may take 2 applications over a year and a half period of stump application to knock it out. And even though it's a good-looking plant, again, here it is at the country club, wrecking this old stone wall from the late 1700s. Now here's Norway Maple. It's mostly grows in Europe. It's a shade-tolerant maple. When you pull the leaf off, it has white sap coming out of the leaf stalk. It's a way to discern it from other maple trees. They grow quite spectacularly, as we all know, in open areas like this, on estates or on golf courses, or in areas like abandoned farms or someone's front yard. But they also are used an awful lot as street trees. And they are an incredible street tree, and arborists know that. But unfortunately, because they have these invasive traits, they have invaded our woodlands now, especially suburban woodlands, and are changing the composition of the woodlands. And they're very effective because they produce a lot of seed and they're shade tolerant. Japanese knotweed is a shrub-like perennial. Now that it's here in the United States, at least in New England, it doesn't really spread through seeds. It's just through its rhizomes. Its root mass is quite large. They were originally planted by horticulture people as a living fence. So wherever you see them, they were probably intentionally planted for a purpose to decorate a yard, or they were dug out and thrown into someone's yard or a waste area, and that's why they're growing. They have a tendency to grow out like goutweed from the center mass, and they sort of move outward from the mother plant and create more and more plants as the rhizomes get bigger. Here's a little girl standing in some 7 or 8 foot stand of Japanese knotweed, just so you can see the scale and how dense it is. And down by her knees, you can see the smaller ones growing. So they're quite a powerful plant. Porcelainberry vine is another invasive, but it's shade intolerant. Its enemy is shade, and it's really loves sun. It's got a nice looking leaf. The berries, they are sort of like alabaster marbles. You know, it's really grown for its leaf shape and its berries. It's quite an attractive plant, but it is attractive to birds, and it does spread around, but it doesn't have the distribution range like a shade tolerant plant would, because porcelainberry only likes sun. So you'll find it on the edge of fields, edge of woodlands, and forest gaps, if it's still growing there, and it's as a shade, it will succumb to shade and die out. Here's porcelainberry vine and flower, small little whitish flowers, and the berries are starting to. Okay, here's common buckthorn, Rhamhus cathartica. It's one of these plants that has two sexes separate from each other, like human beings. So Asiatic bittersweet vine and common buckthorn are separate sex plants most of the time. They have sort of a clumped distribution, not all the time, but it's quite common to see them growing in a mass. I find them to be very invasive, but not as invasive as glossy buckthorn. But they have beautiful berries that are produced for a long time into the fall, and they are attractive to birds. So birds are the vector for this buckthorn shrub, as well as other shrubs and vines that produce berries. Common buckthorn seedlings, I weed these all the time, so I let this one grow up. You can see at the very bottom the primordial leaves, which are sort of, I don't know, sort of rectangular shape. The second set of leaves are sort of, I don't know, roundish, I guess you could say. And then the third set of leaf is really the diagnostic leaf with the prominent veins. I've let these grow up over the seasons to make sure that I got the identification right. So this is a Rhamhus cathartica seedling, and they're quite common where birds roost, and they are they're tolerant of some shade, so they can grow in shady areas, although they do like sun. So they're shade intermediate, I'm pretty sure. All right, now here's a buckthorn, glossy buckthorn, a different buckthorn, sprouting at the country club from the base of a white oak. Now, this is to show you how the land around these trees, this is away from the golf course, but on the edge of a woods, is mowed on a weekly basis. But a lot of buckthorn seedlings come from birds defecating them out in these tall trees on the golf course. But those seedlings are hit by mowers on a weekly or basis or every 10 days. And this one missed the weed whacker and missed the mower. And it's about a 6 or 7 year old buckthorn sprouting from the base of a white oak. So this is a common occurrence and common scene with invasive plants. Sometimes buckthorns will sprout from crotches of trees 20 feet above the ground if enough moisture and organic matter has accumulated in a crotch of a tree. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen that. Is back to common barberry again with these red berries that are very attractive to birds. And black swallow-wort is a vine that's hard to pull out because it has a deep root system. It's in the, let me see here. It's an understory woodland plant. It also grows in open sun, but it's pretty shade tolerant. Grows only about 5, 6, 7 feet tall. It usually is in patches and fields. It can be mowed, and you have to mow it. Every time you mow it, you have to let it grow out to at least 3 feet, and then mow it again, and let it grow out another 2 to 3 or 4 feet, and mow it again. So the time interval between mowings should be at least a month apart. Here's black swallow-wort, the seed capsules, and so they look like in the fall. So why are our invasive plants bad? Well, like I've been speaking about, they take up space, they take up water and nutrients, they create shade, and this is the kind of damage that they really do to native ecosystems. The native seed banks are contaminated, and long-term sources of seeds for further invasion of new areas and reinvasion of already invaded areas are from the seed banks. So these things are not that good. Ecological damage caused by exotic invasive plants. Animal population food sources are affected. Native and non-native animal populations may change as some adopt exotic invasive plant species as their alternative food source. And this occurs especially when species such as glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, and Asiatic bittersweet vine reach high population levels. So let me go into a review of these. I'll keep this slide up while I talk about something related to all of this. And this is exotic invasive plants and native plants. This is the new plant competition problem that favors the exotic invasive and contributes to altering native plant succession. So natural threats to native plant regeneration are animal browsing, poor germination due to low seed viability, deep litter layers that inhibit seed germination, seedling diseases, prolonged flooding, droughty conditions, insect attacks, and the like. Unfortunately, if you add to these natural threats the ever-increasing populations of exotic invasive woody plants, the native woodland parcels that are mostly composed of shade intermediate and shade intolerant trees and shrubs begin to show a decline in their own reproduction cycles. That is, the more that native plants are not germinating and or reaching the seedling and sapling stages, the less successful the parent overstory native tree is at reproducing themselves. This is due to the reproductive success of the competing exotic invasive woody plants that are taking up space, water, and nutrients as understory plants, and with their rapid growth end up casting too much understory shade, which is detrimental to the native overstory tree's reproductive success. In addition, the lack of naturally occurring fires, which are which was a natural component of earlier ecosystems, has created a condition that selects for shrubby and vine-infested understories for some native plant communities. But currently, this condition of fire suppression is also contributing to the increase of exotic invasive shrubs and vines in our native woodlands in some situations. When plant succession or native plant regeneration occurs over time in the absence of exotic invasive woody plants, the woodland develops different age classes originating from the surrounding native overstory trees. Over time, different age classes naturally develop and provide a multi-level structure to the native woodland. So a healthy native self-sustaining woodland has 5 vegetation layers. 1, an overstory. 2, a pole or sapling stage, which is just below the overstory. 3, the shrub stage or the shrub area. 4, woody seedlings, herbs, and ferns and grasses that are about ankle high to knee high. And 5, the ground covers such as soil lichens, mosses, liverworts, and etc. It is very unfortunate that many types of woodland in suburban areas are succumbing to this new structural ecological change of having and/or acquiring a 2-tiered vertical structure composed of a native tree overstory and an exotic invasive shrub layer understory. Look around, you'll see patches of this 2-tiered structure already in place or developing in woodlands that you are familiar with. Exotic invasive shrubs and vines, when allowed to grow and spread in suburban woodlands without being effectively controlled, become very successful understory plants. They outcompete native trees and shrubs during the competitive seedling and sapling stages and slowly change the diversity and structure of the invaded area to become a native tree overstory and an exotic invasive shrub vine understory. Once trees reach overstory heights of 35 to 60 feet or more, they have an extensive and supporting root system that secures their position in the woodland as dominance. However, as decades pass with no invasive plant control, the native overstory weakens or loses vigor and slowly dies as the invasive shrubs and vines continue to spread and reproduce. What was once a native tree and shrub woodland of various sized plants competing in normal successional pathways has now become an exotic invasive shrub and vine understory community with a sparse native overstory. Depending on the site where the woodland exists, this slow reversal of woodland structure and accompanying species replacement could take between 75 and 125 years and cover many acres. So some obvious or visual signs of increasing native overstory decline due to the increase in exotic invasive woody plant invasion. This can be briefly described in the following 3 short scenarios, and these are my short scenarios of what I have observed. I'm sure a lot of you have observed the same. Scenario 1, if you see native tree overstory appears to be strong and vigorous, but pockets of dense and random growth of exotic invasive woody shrub and vine populations colonizing specific areas in the understory. There is little evidence of native tree overstory regeneration in the infested area. Understory shade is increasing in the infested area due to the growing and spreading invasive woody plants, which are also using up even more available soil moisture to the detriment of native tree seedlings. So in this scenario, there's few native tree seedlings, many are gone within 2 to 4 years, that otherwise would be present if the invasive plants were not there. So this scenario 1 has a strong native overstory that appears strong and vigorous, but you'll see an increase in the understory of invasives. Scenario 2 is more of a description of more of a degraded site. Scenario 2 is a sporadic dead and dying native overstory. This is combined with a dense and thriving exotic invasive shrub or vine understory. Understory shade is denser than scenario 1, and the growing invasive woody plants are using more available soil moisture to the detriment of the few remaining native tree seedlings. Now, scenario 3 is the worst, and I've seen all these 3 scenarios. Scenario 3 is sparse native overstory remaining, with a very dense and penetrable understory population of exotic invasive shrubs and or vines. The exotics are successful at reproducing more of their own and have contaminated the existing soil bank with their own seeds for many, many decades. Most native overstory trees in the infested area have died and many have fallen to the ground. This scenario represents a landscape infestation that has resulted in an exotic invasive shrub and vine understory becoming the dominance or becoming the new overstory. The woodland infested parcel has reversed its structure. This new structure or plant arrangement will proceed until it is removed by humans or by natural catastrophic events. I have seen this in Rhode Island, where Asiatic bittersweet vines have dominated several acres of land for the past 50 years and completely wiped out the native overstory trees. They're now dead on the ground. And if you crawl through the invasive vines, you can see the dead stumps and the dead trees as logs on the ground. So this kind of damage being done to our suburban woodlands will occur over our lifetime. When I see sparse native overstory trees remaining in a tremendous amount of understory invasives, that particular situation could be, I could be looking at it now, which could be a 70 or 80-year-old situation. Okay, now we're going to go to Glossy Buckthorn during October. Here is a part of the invasive traits for holding on to your leaves a little bit longer in the fall. This is taken in October, and you can see that Glossy Buckthorn still has some pretty good green leaves, so it can continue to photosynthesize. And here, this was taken of bush honeysuckle on March 26th of last year. You can see snow in the woods in the background. This is taken in Newton, Mass. At Cold Spring Park, and this is bush honeysuckle. It's already pushing out its buds, and the leaves are starting to come out, and it's late March. So it pushes out its leaves earlier. Sometimes, let me back up, Glossy Buckthorn can hold on to its leaves a little bit longer, but bush honeysuckle pushes them out earlier. Some do both. So it's just another trait that gives it a little bit of an edge as time goes on when they compete with our native plants. Now here we have control, and it's the best time for any control option is before a plant flowers. And I want to go over some of these methods of hand pulling, mowing or repeated cutting, herbicide applications, and one thing that's not on here, but I'll mention it, is buckthorn baggies. Some of you listening tonight may know of them. I was tipped off of these black bags that are have a pretty good duration period in sun by not breaking down to put over a cut stump and starve it of light. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But for control methods of invasive plant groups, I like to say that for herbaceous invasives, like Japanese knotweed and garlic mustard. For Japanese knotweed, repeated cutting is the way to go. If you cut and wait for the plant to regrow and then cut it again, you'll have a much better chance over a 5-6 year period of getting rid of it. Now, for example, when Japanese knotweed is green in June, early June, maybe late May, cut it down to the ground. You should wait until it refoliates and resprouts, I should say, with leaves, and then recut it again 1 month later, and then recut that again 1 month later. So you have a time interval. You have to space it out to allow the roots to, push up these plants, and you're really trying to starve the roots every time you cut it. If you cut Japanese knotweed like you would a lawn, and every time you cut it down and you see it reemerge from the ground again and you cut it again when it's only 2 to 3 or 4 inches tall, hormonally it changes and it will stay as a stunted plant, but the roots will still be massive. And then the following spring, it will come back again. You can notice this with other weeds, such as lawn weeds. You mow a lawn, it's mowed every week. You don't have any weed control in it. You'll notice that the dandelions are only 2 to 3 inches tall and they're blooming. So this is the same effect with Japanese knotweed. Now with garlic mustard, it's a biennial. If it's in the stage where it produces flowers, that is the second year, you can cut down that stalk right before it goes into flowering stage, and it will supposedly kill the plant. That's what I've been reading about, and we've done experiments with the Newton conservatives, and it seems to be the case. Some of you who have dealt a lot with garlic mustard probably know that. So garlic mustard can be, if it's easily pulled, but you can cut it down in year 2 of its life cycle, and it will not return. But it will return through the seed or soil seed bank. So you have to have repeated cuttings year after year, and with Japanese knotweed, you have to have repeated cuttings during the year for at least, the literature says 4 to 6 years. I say around 6 years. Once with Japanese knotweed, you've cut it down enough, and you have these 30-day intervals where you cut it down, the root mass or the rhizomes will be small enough that you can either die in place or you can pop them out with a shovel. Now with shrubs and small trees, you can hand pull what you can. What you cannot pull, you can use a weed wrench and pull them out that way. If you can't weed wrench them, then you can cut them and immediately apply glyphosate for woody plants to the freshly cut stump. And these are usually for the hard to wrench out plants. And they usually are the woodies that grow along foundations or in stone walls, usually at the base of other trees where the roots are intermingled with the host native tree, so you can stump applicate them. Apply herbicide for stump application in July, August, September, October, November, December, and January. So the winter months is called winter stump application. And if you have to do a foliar spray on these woodies, you can do that from July through September on the foliage. Now, if you cut these shrubs down, and you don't want to use a herbicide, there's a new thing out now. It's probably been around for a few years out of Michigan or Wisconsin or Minnesota. I think the Great Lakes states someplace, called buckthorn baggies. You just Google that, and you'll find the company that makes them. Newton Conservatives has been experimenting with buckthorn baggies, and I've been a part of it, where you cut buckthorn down to 6-inch stump or an 8-inch stump. You take this specially formulated black plastic bag with a zip tie that they give you. You put it over the stump and pull the zip tie very tight around that stump, and it prevents light from coming in and hitting that stump. It also increases the temperature if it's in the sun. Of that stump, and it takes about 1 year, 12, 13, 14 months for that stump to die in place. And this is good around wetlands. This is good in sensitive areas where you don't want to use any herbicides, or you don't want to have a lot of people compact the soil. So this was buckthorn baggies was brought to my attention by a few people in my class who had used them around wetlands in the state of Rhode Island. So I found out about them from them, and we've been using them at the Newton Conservators, and so far they're working pretty good. They will not work good Asiatic bittersweet vine or tree of heaven, because those two species can sprout from the roots. So even if you suffocate the main stem with a buckthorn baggie, light suffocated, I should say, that doesn't mean that they can't sprout from roots if it's an Asiatic bittersweet vine or a tree of heaven. Now for vines, particularly Asiatic bittersweet vine, you can hand pull them. If they're too big to hand pull, you can cut them and stump applicate it in July, August, September, October, right through the winter, or you can dig it out. Now, a lot of big vines that are difficult to pull off trees, once they've been cut, you should let them hang in the trees for several months. That way they'll dry out and pull off easier a few months later. A lot of people, when they cut these vines from trees, they cut the Asiatic bittersweet vine, and they try to pull the vine off the tree, and it's like the tree is connected to a bunch of bungee cords. You just can't pull the vine down. And when you do pull the vine down, you may destroy or wreck a portion of the tree, especially if it's an ornamental. So it's a big aesthetic appeal problem, but if you cut the vines, let them dry out on the host vegetation, because vines have a high content of water. They have a different wood structure, so they dry out pretty effectively, and they'll break off when you pull them down, if you pull them down 2 or 3 months later. Sometimes I've had to let vines stay hanging in the trees for 6 months before I could pull them down. Okay, so Asiatic bittersweet vine and tree of heaven may not be good candidates, like I said, for buckthorn baggies, because they can sprout new stems from roots. Now, you want to dispose of Asiatic bittersweet vine by cutting it up into 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 foot lengths. And if you have a chipper available, you can put them through a chipper. Or usually chipper manufacturers advise don't put vines through a chipper, but if you cut the vines up and they're not in fruit, they can go through a chipper if you mix it in with other woody brush. If not, you can cut them up into 2 foot lengths and put them into the green waste for pickup for your city or town trash collection. Make sure that they don't have the berries attached. Now, for control methods here, I just want to say that here's hand pulling of garlic mustard at Newton Conservatives in Newton, Massachusetts. And these are all a bunch of high school volunteers. Here's mowing or repeated cutting. And again, like a good example of repeated cutting is with Japanese knotweed. You want to have the cut cycle be once every 28 days to 35 days. So I say about once a month. So you'll cut it, let it grow out. It exhausts the root reserves, and then cut it again, let it grow out. 30 days later, cut it again, and repeat that for 5 or 6 years. And you will really shrink a massive stand of these things right out of the landscape. But like with all invasive plant removal, it's not a pretty sight. It's a lot of hard work, and it does not have any aesthetic appeal as gardening does. So gardening, you can remove weeds within a few minutes or a few hours and keep the garden weeded. But with invasives in woodlands, it's a process, as we all know, and this should be, you should notify your clients, obviously, about all this, that repeated cutting or repeated mowing is a non-toxic method of removing some of these plants. And it does work, but you have to stick with it. Here's some herbicide applications for stump, cut stump application. This was the glossy buckthorn I showed earlier in my slides that was at the base of that white oak at the golf course where I work. I put a dye into the glyphosate compound so you can see that I have done it. You know, That's mostly just for myself. It was one stump application, even though it is starting to sprout, as you can see right there, right below the middle stump. There's a little bit of green. It's starting to sprout, but this was killed, this root mass, with one application of a glyphosate. Now, we have resources, and while the resources is up, I want to speak about safety issues. Herbicides, whichever herbicide you decide to use, it is your responsibility to read and follow all label instructions, and the product must be in compliance with your state-issued pesticide license and targeted pest plant. So match the herbicide to the plant. Be aware that labels of these compounds do change without notice, including restricted use status and state registrations. And if you're working with groups, whether they're paid or volunteer, to help you remove a bunch of invasive plants, particularly these woody shrubs and vines, keep your working groups far enough apart to reduce any risk of injuries, or just reduce injuries, especially during shrub and vine removal and when using weed pulling devices like weed wrenches and cutting tools. Safety glasses, gloves, and tick protection is necessary. You don't want to work fast, because the faster you work doing this kinds of removal with groups that are not really trained very well, but they're willing to provide their labor for you, if they start working fast, this increases the risk of injuries. I've been through this many times. I've dealt with volunteer groups for 25 years, and it's many times I've had to go over to one kid who was using a weed wrench correctly. He's had some problems. He's about 14, 15 years old, and before you know it, his whole class is around him, all grabbing the weed wrench, trying to pull the giant buckthorn out of the ground, and that's when injuries happen. So you don't want that to happen. You have to always keep track of where your volunteer groups are, where your paid staff is usually more experienced. Okay, power tools such as chainsaws and gas-powered pole pruners with a hedge trimmer attachment, which I like to use for going into vines and also cutting down Japanese knotweed. And any wood chippers should be used only by trained individuals, and all necessary personal safety equipment must be worn during the operation of these types of equipment. And disposal of refuse. So for herbaceous materials such as garlic mustard and black swallow-wort, if those two are in flower, they need to be bagged and put into the trash for regular trash pickup for incineration. However, if you have vines like Asiatic bittersweet vine and shrubs that are woody that can be put through a wood chipper for processing into wood chips, that's another way of disposing these things. We used to do that at the Audubon Society. We wood chipped up every invasive shrub and vine, including ones that were in berries, that were in berry production, and the trauma of the berries going through the chipper and into the wood chip pile. When we distributed the wood chips on trails, we never saw any of these Asiatic bittersweet vines or glossy buckthorns sprout. So we had a wood chip dealer tell us that the trauma of the plants in fruit going through the chipper shakes up the seeds so bad that they don't really germinate, although some probably could, but we didn't see any. One thing about dealing with woody shrubs and vines is you must stack them in a orderly way and in small stacks. Now they can be stacked for off-site removal, so city and town forestry departments will pick them up for you if you're doing an invasive removal project on some city or town land. But you'll have to make arrangements for this to happen before your project starts. But stacking shrubs that have been pulled out of the ground where the roots are at one end, and all the roots are at one end and the tops are at another end, and you make them in piles that are close to a trail or a parking lot so they can easily be then stacked into a truck to be removed later on or brought to a chipper. That's much better. Okay, so resources for these plants here are invasive plants of Atlas of New England. As you can see, invasive.org is number 2. There's the Nature Conservancy, and you have wildlife, government resources, Invasive Plant Association, and Ecological Landscape Alliance. We've written a lot about these plants on our website. I just want to check one thing here. Resources about books. The Brooklyn Botanic Garden has these beautiful books out, Invasive Plants, Weeds of the Global Garden. And you should also buy the one if you want to, Native Alternatives to Invasive Plants. There's an Alien Invasion, America's Battle with Non-Native Animals and Plants, put up by National Geographic Society. Is a great book to give you an overall viewpoint of these things. And also Biological Pollution by Bill McKnight. It's an older book. It's written by a lot of invasive experts, and they have profiled their own projects in different states. Now, while this resources is up, I'd like to just mention something else here pretty quickly about current public attitudes and how they need to change concerning the definition of what is a pest. In other words, we must convince the public that exotic invasive plants are actual pests of the site. When left unchecked, they will slowly reduce the vigor of native plants and cause them to eventually die out in the infested area. Now, many people do not view exotic invasive plants as threatening pests to our local parks and sanctuaries as they do for the commonly encountered high-profile insect pests. However, invasive plants in local parks are actual pests to the site and its native plant ecology, and due to their invasive traits, are causing a slow decline in native plant species germination, establishment, continued growth, and therefore sustainability. Native tree and shrub successional pathways have become altered, slowed down, or stopped in the infested area. So this is the kind of slow damage that they do over many decades. Now, unlike quicker acting winter moth, hemlock, woolly adelgid, and Asian longhorn beetle infestations that reduce specific tree species vigor over a 5 to 10 year period, invasive glossy buckthorn shrub layer invades the ground and can build to such high density that it interrupts normal native plant reproduction cycles by co-competing for water, nutrients, and soil space, and most importantly, creating too much shade for the native overstory shade intermediate and shade intolerant trees to successfully seed themselves in and regenerate. It takes 2 or more seasons of winter moth infestations to raise alarm from homeowners and municipalities that something destructive is happening to our native trees. But little concern is raised by those same people or most anyone else about exotic invasive plant infestations. Insect damage is noticeable because it is short-term damage involving leaf loss. Native tree weakening or vigor loss due to intense competition by exotic invasive shrubs is harder to notice because it is very long-term. And 1, the exotic invasive woody shrubs are green and are assumed to be native. 2, native tree and shrub reproduction cycles are slowed or completely stopped due to the increased shade created by the exotics, and this process is a gradual one unnoticed by many. 3, native plant competition for water, nutrients, space, and sunlight is reduced by the ever-increasing and competitive shade-casting glossy buckthorn and other invasive plant populations. It's all working in concert together. So the resulting stress results in reducing native tree and shrub vigor. Trees and shrubs get weaker, grow slower, and become more subjected to other environmental stresses, pathogens, and insect pests. This invasive plant problem is therefore a long-term event, taking anywhere from 50 to 150 years of exotic invasive plant growth and spread, and it plagues all city and town conservation lands in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and beyond. Many of these invasive plants have been here longer than we have been alive. They are slow-killing agents in our remaining woodlands. So many people are not aware of this problem. Exotic invasive plants are viewed as just green plants in the woods. Exotic invasive woody plants have been treated by early horticulturists as pioneer species because they produce colorful berries, which is an ornamental wildlife appeal value. They grow fast. They have broad soil and site growing conditions, which is a pioneer species characteristic, and they can be pruned, which is very good for home yards. So unless you were working in the horticulture industry or in ecology, you were not notified about the pest-like invasive traits of these exotic plants before the early 1990s. Many plant ID books and guides and nursery catalogs rarely mentioned that these particular plants were invasive. They used the term weedy, which implied to the consumer that the escaped exotic in the woods was becoming naturalized and would adapt to our ecosystems, as many other escaped plant introductions have done. So as we all know, people can see insect damage, but they cannot see a slow reduction in native plant growth and vigor caused by exotic invasive ground-inhabiting shrubs or invasive vines until the overstory tree or trees have died, or they're starting to die. So most homeowners control the spread of invasive plants in their yards. However, unmanaged conservation lands express the characteristic invasive damage because there are little to none continued organized control efforts and educational programs teaching about the dangers of these new pests in most cities and towns in Massachusetts and in New England. Remember, most people cannot recognize poison ivy. So without proper educational programs provided by garden clubs, nonprofit conservation organizations, and the like, there is little exotic invasive plant information available to the public, especially as a demonstration woodland. This could be why many people are unaware of the perils of exotic invasive plant infestations. They see the shrubby clutter in the woods, but they don't understand or they are unaware of the actual long-term ecological damage they are causing. And it's so long-term that it could exceed our own lifetime. So just as with poison ivy, most people cannot properly identify exotic invasive plants. So continuous control programs are necessary for regaining native plant populations' abilities to continue their germination, establishment, growth, and successional pathways, and finally their sustainability. So here we have the resources to learn more about all this. And if you have any questions, you can type them now. Here we have books to help you with shrub identification. These books by George W.D. Simmons. Excellent. They're old books from the 60s. They're still in print. They're picture books, and they give a lot of information right to the point. One's called the Shrub Identification Book. The other one is called the Tree Identification Book. I, like many others, have both of these books. They're old standard college textbooks that have excellent photographs that are in black and white. And here we have the shade tolerance ratings of some common native plants of the oak hickory forest cover type. And I did the oak hickory forest cover type because the country club in Brookline, Mass is just in the oak hickory forest. So this is shade intolerant plants. These are pioneer species. They need full sun. Shade is a limiting factor for adequate growth. Now the trees that are native, that are shade intolerant, are eastern red cedar, pin cherry, sassafras, paper birch, tamarack aspens, and the intolerant invasives are tree of heaven and black locust. And the shade intolerant invasive vine is porcelain berry vine. Sorry. It's getting late. Okay, so I wanted to put the shade tolerance ratings for the invasives and recognizable trees together so you can see that they have the same sun requirements or shade tolerance ability. Next, you have shade intermediate or mid-tolerant plants. These need sun but can tolerate partial shade. Most of our woodlands, town forests, town woodlands, city woodlands made up of shade intermediate overstory trees. And they're usually red, white, and black oaks, shagbuck hickory, bitternut hickory, butternut, black birch, eastern white pine, black cherry, red maple, black ash, red pine, and many others. The shrubs, viburnum, witch hazel, and winterberry, and huckleberry, and shrubs like that. But the invasives that are shade intermediate are Japanese barberry, common barberry, bush honeysuckles, and Japanese knotweed. So that's why if you see any of these invasives in a woodland that's old and they're in amongst the shade, they started obviously when the overstory was a lot younger and a lot more open. They can hang out for many years in shade, but eventually these shade intermediates will succumb to constant shade and have a slow death. That is these invasives. The last is shade-tolerant plants. These can tolerate full shade or low light conditions. They can grow in the shade of other species as well as their own. They can also grow in full sun with adequate soil moisture in the seedling or sapling stage. So our shade-tolerant plants, these are the climax species they call them, are eastern hemlock, sugar maple, and American beech. Basswood is also shade-tolerant. And up in Maine and Canada, balsam fir is. But the invasive shade tolerance is Norway maple. The invasive shrubs that are shade tolerant are glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, winged euonymus, and multiflora rose. And the shade tolerant invasive vine is Asiatic bittersweet vine, and herbaceous ground cover is garlic mustard. So I put this together again to show you the shade tolerant natives along with the invasives. So if you read any of these forestry books and you read about how natural native plant succession goes, or the fate of succession from young woodlands to old woodlands, shade tolerance ratings and available soil moisture is very important for how that progresses. And then when you introduce these invasive plants that also are shade tolerant, then it begins to change the fate of succession of these native plants. So this shade tolerance ratings little page here, and if anybody wants it, I can send it to them, or Penny will send it to them. You can actually add to it or make your own. It gives you a better perspective on how shade tolerance ratings of these invasives are very important. It's one of the most important, I think, invasive trait. It really allows, if a plant is shade tolerant, to invade deep into woodlands for many, many years. Now, time for questions.
Can you explain why you have to allow some invasives to grow up several inches before mowing them down?
Sure. You want to exhaust the root reserves. So when a plant is cut, whether it's a home lawn or whether it's Japanese knotweed or glossy buckthorn, once it's cut, it resprouts from the available root carbohydrates. Well, I should say the energy or carbohydrates stored in the roots. So when it's cut, it uses those reserves and it pushes up new growth. So if you continually mow it every time it pushes up new growth, as if you're treating it like it's a lawn, hormonally that plant will be signaled to not push up any more new growth, and it can stay in a bonsai, let's say, state of development for a long period of time. This may have this trait or this reaction may have occurred through evolution by plants saving themselves to be in the environment if they've been overgrazed by a lot of animals in their native environment. But the reason why you have an interval between cutting and then you let the plant grow up and then you cut it again and let the plant grow up and cutting it again is because you want to reduce those stored carbohydrate reserves in the roots, and you'll slowly starve the plant of carbohydrates, shrink the roots so they'll be able to be dug out easier, or they'll die on their own. But you have to be on that cutting cycle for several years. So for, Japanese knotweed, cut it, 4 to 6 times during the summer months, during, June through September or October, and then do it the same way for the next successive 5 years. If you have a very large population of Japanese knotweed, and eventually you'll shrink the roots up enough on that kind of cutting cycle to starve the plants of its carbohydrates, and you'll kill the plant. Or you'll weaken it enough, so it will be able to be either pulled out or dug out.
Okay, thank you. Can you explain the timing and frequency for pulling Multiflora Rose to effectively wipe it out?
All right, Multiflora Rose is tough to get rid of because it's got those spines or thorns or whatever, and I treat it the same as buckthorn. So I'll go in with heavy gloves and cut the plant right back so I can get at it. And if I can get it out with a weed wrench or hand pull it with heavy gloves, I'll do that. If I can't, I'll just stump applicate it. And with a glyphosate poison ivy killer herbicide. And if I do it July, August, September, or into the winter, it will successfully be killed. But if you can't pull it, I'd stump applicate it. You can try buckthorn baggies on those, but if they're multi-stemmed, it might be hard for the bag to wrap around it. So my advice with Multiflora Rose is to just cut it off the host plant if it's acting like a vine, and just cut it all back, and then get to the stump, whether it's a foot high, try to pull it out. If you can't pull it out, you're only your next best bet would be just to stump applicate it in place during the late summer months and into the winter. Okay.
How do you control a dense stand of large winged euonymus?
All right, the same way. I've done this several times. I usually go in and cut winged euonymus down, and I try to get at the stumps with a weed wrench. And if I can't pull them out, young winged euonymuses, sometimes they're not really that deep, but 5, 6, 7-year-old and older, they can get they have very fibrous root systems, and they can hold on to the soil pretty effectively. So if you can't weed wrench them out, again, you're going to have to stump applicate them. They're a tough plant, and they do sprout from roots also. So if they're quite old plants. So I would go the stump application route, do it a little at a time. And, I like to say to people, and I say to a lot of volunteers I've worked with, there's no race to get rid of these things. If you have a plan that's continuous cutting and removal and stump application, whatever your management plan is going to be, and it's on an ongoing basis year after year, that means you are a success. It shouldn't be a time limit on it, or some place where it may be unsightly. But with winged euonymus, if they're old, I know of winged euonymus as being close to 70 or 80 years old. So they can be so thick in diameter that you'll need to have them cut down with a chainsaw and then have a stump grinder come in and take it out. But if it's just a big mass, small stand, 6, 7 feet tall, you can easily go in and cut them, remove them all, leave the stumps up, hand pull what you can. If you can't do that, weed wrench them. If you can't do that, then cut the stump down to 1 inch above the ground and apply an herbicide that will kill it. And usually do that during the late summer, where it's the season. It really facilitates the downward movement of plant compounds, and will help bring the herbicide down to the roots and kill it.
All right. Next, moving on to Japanese barberry. What's the best control strategy and timing for cutting Japanese barberry?
All right. Japanese barberry. Let me see. I have this. I don't have it with me here. Okay. Well, Japanese barberry. is, again, the reason why people don't like to deal with it because it's because of these spines on it. It's treated the same as any other woody invasive. So you can get any of these things before they flower and fruit. And when you see them in the flowering stage, you can then cut them down. If the flowering stage for Japanese barberry is probably in, I don't know, June, you can cut it down to like 6-inch stumps, and then remove that material, and then go in with a weed wrench and pull it. If not, you'd have to stump applicate it with an herbicide in August, like that. And now what you could do with barberry is cut it, get all the branches that stick you away from, and leave a lone stump or multiple stumps there, and let it refoliate to weaken the roots, force the roots to use the stored carbohydrate reserves, and then go in a few weeks later or a month or two later, like in August or September, and then stump applicate it that way, and you'll be more assured of killing it in place. That's if they're big plants. But a lot of people don't like to deal with these invasives that have thorns on them. But there's no magic formula. They have to be treated the same way as if it was glossy buckthorn. They're woody, and they can either be pulled or by hand or by a weed wrench or stump applicated. A lot of times I have to cut my way in to these plants like winged euonymus to get to the stumps or the main stems, or barberries to get to the main stems before I can actually treat the stump or pull it out. So just make sure you wear your good gloves.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions for dealing with Japanese stiltgrass?
I don't know anything about Japanese stiltgrass. I've never had to deal with it, but I'm just guessing now, because it's a grass, you can keep on mowing it or cutting it down. And I know with other ornamental grasses, I've dug a lot of them out of the ground. So what I would usually do would be cut it to the ground, remove the tops, and then just dig it out of the ground. Or if you want to use an herbicide on something like that, and you can do it, make sure that it's fully leafed out, and then apply the herbicide, preferably in July or August. And the more contact, herbicide leaf contact, the more of the herbicide will go into the roots and kill it. But that's my only advice, since I never have dealt with that particular invasive.
Okay. Do you have any experience dealing with the flaming tools to deal with tree of heaven in a stone wall?
Okay, I sort of do. Okay, I've used a flamer on lawn grasses. I've never used it against tree of heaven, but I have dealt with tree of heaven an awful lot. And if you flame it above the ground and you can't heat up the roots, it will come back. And even if you kill the main roots of the main stem, it doesn't mean you've killed the root completely. It could come back as a root sprout later on in the season or the following year. So my advice, you can try it, and if you are partly successful, then keep on going back and doing it again, if you don't want to use an herbicide on it. But tree of heaven has weird roots. They can push up top growth at the same time push down a lot of roots. So they can grow simultaneously with root mass and top growth. So it's one of those weird plants that's extremely persistent in the environment.
All right. Can Japanese knotweed be controlled mechanically?
Mechanically, meaning pulled out of the ground, it's very hard because it'll break off. So mechanically, when it comes to, like, say, cutting it, that's the way I choose to do it. I don't use an herbicide on Japanese knotweed because sometimes it seems to be herbicide resistant. At the country club in Brookline, when they did get permission to use an herbicide, we always did it on Japanese knotweed during the flowering stage. because that's its weakest point in its life cycle, where it's using a lot of energy. But mechanically, through cutting, if you cut it on a monthly basis, must let the Japanese knotweed, after it's been cut, grow out for about 30 days, and then cut it again, and then let that grow out for another 30 days. Because what you're trying to do is manage the size of the root. You're trying to shrink that root, and you're forcing it to, after you cut it, you're forcing it to resprout. And every time it resprouts, it uses up more root energy and root mass. So I would just cut it on a monthly basis for 3, 5, 6, 7 years in a row. And I've done that in my backyard, and it has worked. So I'm a big fan of cutting Japanese knotweed.
All right. Glyphosate, is there a requirement in Massachusetts to have some kind of applicator's license for using this herbicide?
Yes, if you're a homeowner and you're working on your own property, you do not need it. However, if you're a professional and you're working on someone else's property, you need a license and the accompanying insurance to do it. If you are working with volunteers on state or city-owned property, you have to have an authority from the Forestry or Parks Department who is a licensed applicator, do the work or supervise, I'm pretty sure, another licensed applicator. I could be wrong on that one, but I know I'm right on that. Only a licensed applicator on state and city properties are able to use the herbicide. Now, the reason for that is they don't want commercial people and state people abusing the herbicide, but they want the sales for the herbicide, so they allow homeowners to buy glyphosate products without a license, at least in Massachusetts. So if someone's doing it on their own property, they don't need a license. If they're in business for themselves and they're gardeners or arborists and they're working on other people's properties, they do need a license and they need insurance.
Okay. All right. Thank you. The next question is about someone who's interested in volunteering to help with invasive management. Do you have any recommendations for that?
Yes, you can go to Massachusetts Audubon Society, where I used to work. They always are looking for able-bodied, as they say, volunteers. I worked with over 110 volunteers over a 15-year period when I worked at Mass Audubon, or actually even more than that. The trustees of reservations are always looking for, also looking for volunteers to help with invasive removal projects. Local garden clubs in your town, they may have an invasive project that they've taken on at a particular town or city property, or an Audubon property or whatever. So garden clubs are also great places to inquire about that. And the Newton Conservators, I live in Newton, Mass, so N-E-W-T-O-N, Newton Conservators, if you're living in this area, are also looking for volunteers, and they have their own schedules. You can go on the website, newtonconservators.org, and they'll steer you in the right direction. So there's mostly non-profit conservation organizations, whether they're large or small. And you can even check out Mass Hort Society. They don't have any volunteers, I don't think, yet, but they have a huge woods up there in Wellesley, and it's inundated with a ton of glossy buckthorn. So if you wanted to start a volunteer service for one of these nonprofits, talk with them, and you can start your own little project for them under their guidance. I think they'd be receptive to that. And sometimes locally owned, state-owned, or even privately owned cemeteries may take on volunteers for invasive plant projects. So those are the big organizations that I would recommend right now.
All right. Another group in New Hampshire is the Stewardship Network. And I know if you do a Google search for that group, they post a lot of different volunteer opportunities, especially in spring when different volunteer groups are looking for volunteer help. So you can check out the Stewardship Network. And we have one last question, Bruce, and this is, you mentioned common buckthorn. Is that a native?
Right. There's glossy buckthorn, and then there's common buckthorn. Common is usually called European buckthorn, and they're both from, one's mostly from Asia. The other one, the European or common one, is from mostly from Europe, and they're both exotic invasive plants. We do have a native buckthorn, but the two that are invasive that I've listed on the shade intolerance slides, those in red are all invasive.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bruce, for sharing all of this valuable information. This is a wealth of knowledge about invasives, and for sharing all of these practical tips to help us control invasive plants. So thank you again, Bruce, for all of this great information that you've shared with us. And thank you all for participating, and good luck with your invasive plant management.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Pat.